do that.
Are we ready to go now?
Yes, I think you're ready to go.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody. Our panel is called Reclaiming Narratives, Southern History in Technicolor. My name is Theodora Light. My friends call me Tedi, so y'all are welcome to that as well. My other panelists, my colleagues, are Jared Asser and Ariana Persico. We are from pretty wide ranges of the North American continent, and we cover an equally wide range of historical topics, but we are drawn together by sort of decolonial theory and methodology, and how that can sort of broaden the interpretive and qualitative aspects of our work. So this is what we're going to be talking about today in the sort of wide-ranging historical fields that we each cover. So I wanted to briefly kind of introduce us as scholars and as people. As I said, my name is Tedi Light or Theodora Light. I'm not sure what it is on the bio. I'm originally from Athens, Georgia, here at the university, but I spent the last years, about 8 years in Beaufort, South Carolina. I got my undergrad at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, and I'm pursuing a master's degree in history here at the University of Georgia. Broadly, I study 16th and 17th century Indigenous history in Florida, and how networks of power and communication sort of spread across the circum-Caribbean. My colleague, Ariana Persico, she got her MA at the University of Oregon, and she came all the way here to Georgia to work with both of our major advisor, James Brooks. She incorporates both historical, archaeological, and public history methodologies to examine trauma, repatriation, and memory in the Native South. Our colleague Jared Asser is, they're both PhD students. Sorry, I should have said that. And he is from Canada, all the way up from Ottawa, but which is near Toronto. I guess that's probably more known. And he works in three broad overlapping areas. I want to get this right. The political and cultural history of the American far right, music history, and then more recently, the history of emotions. So now that you know a little about each of us, I think it's time for us to get started. I am going to kick this off with, I guess, what will be probably generic history presentation. I was shocked yesterday to see, kind of as Joe McGill was talking about, the range of presenters at this conference and the exciting stuff that they're all covering. I think mine is going to be a little, maybe not as fun as what everyone else is talking about, but nevertheless, I am excited to present. So, as I have already said, my name is Theodora Light, and we're going to be talking about decolonial theory as it relates to land loss and its partner in land back movements in the colonial South. It's my belief that colonized spaces, those built on one hand on the expulsion of Indigenous populations and the exploitation of enslaved peoples on the other hand, have especially complicated histories. They involved negotiated power schemes that were not always uneven. In the US South, however, Europeans and their descendants developed pseudo-legal mechanisms akin to what I've termed as a Frankenstein's monster, absorbing and adapting new ways to expel or entrap Indigenous and African descendant peoples according to contemporary political and social conditions. I've thus titled this paper, Colonial Frankenstein, Constructing a Legal Monster to Regulate Race and Place. So building on this framework, today I will make this case. Those native territories where the Spanish first dispossessed Indigenous people are again contested on unnatural Gulf and resort coasts. The Gullah Geechee of the Sea Islands are fighting to keep their ancestral lands. I've actually forgotten to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. Let's see. Here we go. Good. All right. There's the title, there's me, and now we move on. So Indigenous and Black Americans have been purposefully excluded from a substantial source of power in the US for generations, the accumulation and development of property. Homeownership is both a physical and financial security, a place to shelter, and a potential investment. A 2019 survey of consumer finances showed, before COVID, the typical white family has 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. In line with this fiscal data, a substantial chasm exists in the homeownership figures among white, Black, Hispanic, and other families, though it diminishes with age. Putting aside the problematic use of the term other, which has had some fantastic blowback on Twitter and social media, these figures often represent the descendant communities of Indian removal. When I refer to other, there was a CNN exit poll during the elections that referred to Indigenous people as something else. And I just selected one of the many memes that was created, that one of my favorites. In teasing out histories of the South, Indigenous history must be taken beyond the contact moment and the Trail of Tears. In many ways, this historical void creates a structurally unsound foundation for our understanding of Southern history, contributing to a society of inequity, especially as it relates to land and wealth. Indigenous communities of the South are much more than other or something else, and their histories are much deeper than the trauma of the forced removal and Trail of Tears. Understanding the persistence of colonial power structures reveals the ways in which our past can so monstrously echo our present. Most of us are well aware of the massive land and demographic losses suffered by Indigenous Americans after the arrival of Europeans. But Southern history has a particularly fraught past, tied to the way in which it is entangled with identity and memory. Andrew Denson powerfully argues that Southerners in particular, quote, grounded their identities in distinct images, which overlook Native American topics almost entirely. The literature is often grounded in the memory of the Civil War and slavery and its legacy, meaning that though we conceptualize Southern memory in terms of race, it happens on a dichotomy of Black and white. And while my educational priorities mean I hope to insert a deeper knowledge of Indigenous histories, it can't be as simple as an Indian. It must revolve around the intricate and evolving nature of power, which was certainly a negotiated system, but one whose primary foothold was determined in unequal colonial interactions. So 2 basic premises are vital to establishing this history of power. First, the South was affected by contact with the Spanish from the beginning of the 60s. And second, even to the 19th century, Indigenous people comprised substantial parts of the Southern population. As Claudio Sant points out, the population of the South was mostly Indigenous, even through the forced migration of the 1830s. That being said, you'll often hear the title Spanish Florida, but historians know that little about Florida was ever Spanish. save its struggling mission systems, garrisons, and St. Augustine. Spaniards might have numbered between 25 and 3,500, compared to up to 16,000 indigenous Floridians at the end of the 18th century. The 5 civilized tribes are relatively late to this picture. Thousands of these people lived along the coasts, at salt marsh estuaries and riversheds, where their people had resided for generations. Among them were the who, for nearly 2 centuries following Ponce de Leon, who they killed, protected their cultural and physical autonomy on the southwestern tip of Florida and participated actively in the reshaping of the region's power dynamics. Through 2 historical events, the Yamasee War and Stono Rebellion, we can see how colonial frameworks mutated to fix or expel indigenous and African peoples, especially as this relates to slavery, both Indian and African. Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabel prohibited Indian slavery during their reign. However, a series of permissions in 1500, 1503, and 1504 granted justifications for the enslavement of cannibals and captives of just wars. These ordinances opened early slaving and colonial interests into the South by the Spanish, but most consequently, an act in 1506 permitted the purchase or ransom of Indian slaves already in the possession of other indigenous peoples. Mississippian captive taking, which predated European contact, underwent dramatic alterations. Proving as adaptive as a system as many of the indigenous people like the Yamasee, who came to dominate the trade itself, Andres Reséndez has pointed out that, quote, like a deadly virus, Indian slavery mutated and became extraordinarily resistant through the centuries. Perhaps the birthplace of the colonial Stein, through this mutating system, pseudo-legalized slavery dramatically altered the footprint of ancestors across the South, leading to indigenous discontent, rebellion, and repression. The Guale rebelled in 1645, the Appalachee in 47, Timucua in 1656, and the Apalachicola in 1675 and 81. In retribution, groups like the Appalachee were subjected to a forced labor draft, which became progressively severe during the construction of St. Augustine's stone fort. Once fiercely independent, Florida's chiefdoms were rampaged by disease and tribute requirements, such that they became unable to protect themselves from slave raiding from the English and their indigenous allies. Even in the mission-based system of Florida, where Spaniards were always an extreme minority, growing disparities created by the colonial machine combined with external forces to alter traditional homelands. As Robbie Etheridge has illustrated, many protohistoric communities coalesced with others for safety, while some were destroyed altogether. The increasing violence culminated in the devastating Yamasee Wars between 1715 and 17. Alan Gallay insists that in addition to trade abuses, mounting debts that could not be repaid, and fear of enslavement, groups including the Yamasee also offered coordinated indigenous resistance to colonial designs on native land. Once the English most prominent ally in enslaving raids into Florida, the Yamasee were faced with the reality that trade in animal pelts and slaves was declining, while rice was becoming more important. Yamasee lands were perfect for rice cultivation. The Yamasee Wars, Carolina colony to the brink of extinction. No other colony came as close, nor did they ever exchange in the policy of trade for Indian slaves to such an extent again. It is a definitive turn, instead, to enslaved Africans. It's also when they decide to create the Georgia colony as a buffer between Carolina and Spanish Florida. Despite the circumstances they faced, Florida Indians maintained heavy demographic majorities and the advantages of generational knowledge of land. Throughout the early colonial period, they served as vital intermediaries between the colonies, circulating information and aid. Alejandra Dubkovsky states that while these relationships and the networks they created were often uneven, they were also incredibly varied. Both Indigenous and African peoples played a vital role in the creation of the region's changing power dynamics. While there was still some legal ambiguity, by the late 17th, Carlos II of Spain had decreed that those fleeing enslavement from English colonies would be granted freedom in Florida. In 1656, the Spanish ordered an incursion in Carolina, which destroyed the Scottish settlement at Stewartstown. Dubkovsky argues that the governor hoped especially to convince English Indigenous allies to switch allegiances. The members of St. Augustine's first Black militia were there. As Jane Landers explains, quote, Black militiamen were significant for their linguistic and cultural abilities, their knowledge of the frontier, and their military skills. They would have also powerfully communicated the promise of freedom in Florida to their enslaved counterparts in the Carolinas. As the South Carolina colony grew and became more prosperous on the back of enslaved labor, planters keenly aware of their disadvantageous position in relation to the populations of enslaved peoples. They feared this in combination with the knowledge of Spanish freedom. There has been increasing debate on the Stono Rebellion, a revolt for liberty, which perhaps included 100 people, between 60 and 75 of whom died. These recent debates centered around religion and spontaneity, while indeed important factors in the specifics, lose sight of this negotiation of power occurring in the early South since the Spanish arrivals earlier. 2,500 runaway ads ran in the Charleston newspapers in the 18th century. Where were they headed? Well, certainly many may have gone north. Muriel Miller Branch noted hundreds of African American encampments between the borders of South Carolina and St. Augustine. These factors, combined with Florida's continued use of Black militiamen, strongly indicate a network of communication which apprised people of the opportunity of freedom in Florida. South Carolina's government and planting elite propagated violent laws which bookended Stono. On August 18th, less than a month before the event, the South Carolina Gazette published the Security Act, requiring that all white men carried firearms in churches. While this certainly suggests a general fear of uprising, I would also suggest this is a reaction to the broader regional political situation. Because the way information pervaded the early South, they felt the need to create increasingly violent mechanisms to keep enslaved people in place. This becomes even more apparent when, after Stono, the South Carolina General Assembly amended the existing slave codes, adding the infamous 1740 South Carolina Negro Act, which prohibited literacy among enslaved people. Documents publicizing the Spanish edicts offering freedom, of which there would have been several, and the ability for enslaved and masterless people to read and share them would certainly have circulated through these information networks. In order to prevent the movement that this necessarily caused, increasingly violent and coercive mechanisms were implemented. Eventually, English weaponization of slavery overcame Indigenous resistance, even in the staunchest enclaves in Florida, like those of the Calusa. Their communities had, for generations, sustained their population through aquatic economies, much like the Gullah Geechee would later on. This aquaculture and European inability and unwillingness to adapt contributed significantly to the Calusa's ability to maintain cultural continuity for nearly a 200-year span following the Spanish arrival. But there were significant consequences both for their neighbors, the Tocobago, the Makosa, the Izita, and the Pocoy, and eventually their own survival. By the 1710s, the Calusa and others evacuated South Florida in substantial numbers, many of them landing at Havana and Guanabacoa, the Pueblo de Indios. Many of the surviving population of Mose, and I say Mose, but somebody pronounced it Mose the other day, and now I question myself, also evacuated to Guanabacoa, which is known today for its Black Cuban population. They also evacuated to Guanabacoa and Havana. While it was an uneven and varied process across the region, which followed the fits and starts of the construction of power systems, land development has made a relatively steady march across the South for the last 500 years. Like the Calusa, Gullah communities of Beaufort County held on to the demographic majorities for hundreds of years past our expectations. Before major bridges connected St. Helena and Hilton Head Islands to the mainlands in 1927 and 59, respectively, their populations remained well into the 90% range. The shift would be most dramatic on Hilton Head. In 1931, Alfred Lee Loomis and his brother-in-law Landon Thorne purchased 20,000 of Hilton Head Island's 25,000 acres. Most would be a private hunting range. But between 1950 and 51, they sold the land in two pieces for over $1 million. These large tracts served as the foundation for the subsequent development boom we see the stars of today. Beginning with Hilton Head Company's investments in the 50s, the first gated community at Sea Pines led to a tremendous focus on similar developments, as well as a population boom during the second half of the 20th century, which forced out nearly the entirety of Black Islanders. Between 1950 and 1975, that Black population declined from 90% to 9%. Today, it's around 7%, and many of those are perhaps not Gullah descendants. Residents of historic communities like Mitchellville possess properties of tremendous value for their pristine coastal locations after the development boom, properties that families struggled to retain. Rather than simply moving for more opportunity, the legal battles of heirs' properties have contributed to major land loss. For a variety of reasons, a landowner did not possess a deed at the time the land was rightfully willed to them, and a fractious multi-owner inheritance followed this property through time. While not unique even to this part of Beaufort County, let alone the coastal Southeast, or even Black families, this one sea island has witnessed an almost complete removal of a former Black majority and an erasure of important historical legacies of Gullah culture and people. Here, these deeds often originated from the first generations of freed people claiming title to lands upon which they were formerly enslaved. But these legacies are being lost to greedy developers and land speculators who have been quick to take advantage of what might be aptly characterized as legal loopholes. Between 1910 and 1997, Black families in the U.S. lost 90% of their land, a third of which is heirs' property. The Department of Agriculture calls it the leading cause of Black involuntary land loss. Heirs' property, simply stated, is the result of unequal power created by a colonial system, what our colonial Frankenstein looks like in the 21st century. I often think about the fight to save Gullah land holdings when I write about my own subjects, those Calusa and Safety Harbor peoples who held on to such similar land on the Florida coast. Land back is a startling and powerful cry, hearkening us to fight for justice today in the name of those who came before us. From the Oceti Sakowin of the Black Hills to the Mashpee Wampanoag in eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Indigenous Americans are battling today for protection, use, and claims to their ancestral homelands, part of new and growing land back movements across North America. That same fight looks different in the South. I believe that understanding the deeply rooted networks of power that went into their forced removals is key in protecting other communities who are seeking to remain in their homes and on their ancestral lands. Vast human transformation has changed the largely beach, wetland, riverine, and maritime forest environments into a collection of golf clubs, beach resorts, and gated communities, some with deeply problematic names. Mother Nature, her hurricanes, and other increasingly severe weather events has posed some of the further questions for these scars of modern colonialism across the landscape. Understanding how power was constructed in the colonial South helps us resultant, mutated regime akin to a Frankenstein, which continues to affect, actively and not, where people might claim a homeland. Okay, I don't know how to, there, okay. Okay, and now I will turn it over to my colleague, Ariana Persico, who is going to take this. I don't know how it works here. Ariana.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to reintroduce myself. My name is Ariana Persico. I'm currently getting my PhD under the direction of James Brooks at the University of Georgia. And I'm very happy and very thankful to be here with two of my colleagues and my friends. I would also like to take a second to say that we will be answering questions at the end of our presentation. So if you want to throw them in the chat or just reserve them until we're done, that would be awesome. I would also like to take a second to acknowledge what day it is. It is September 30th. It is the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And, you know, some of these events are often, they can be performative when it comes from government entities or people supporting it and then, you know, forgetting about it in the next week. And I just would like to acknowledge our ancestors that we have lost, and the elders and present Native people who continue to fight to remember those lives lost in residential schools. My topic today, I will be talking about some of my own research that I have done at the University of Georgia Special Collections. And I will say it is in the beginning stages of research as well. So there's a lot of thoughts and threads that I have yet to explore. But this is my story. As I walked across Hull Street in the pouring rain, staring at the Richard B. Russell Special Collections Library building, I felt a sense of impending doom or dread. The seemingly monolithic white building looms, tall and proud to be carrying artifacts and documents from the past. I feel the weight of this project heavy on my mind and on my shoulders as I walk up the slippery steps. With every step, I pass through a different emotion: excitement, fear, hope, pride, on and on, alternating between highs and lows until I walk through the doors. In my mind, I'm running through a game plan of which of the 7 artifacts that I have requested that I want to spend the most time with, and suddenly, I don't know what it was, I felt ready. I check in and pass through 2 sets of locked double doors, chatting with a kind reading room librarian while I set up my table, preparing for the past to rest upon it. I sit waiting for almost 45 minutes, wondering where my 7 artifacts are, becoming more and more anxious as time goes on. The reading room librarian answers the phone 3 times to discuss who has requested the Capitol Museum objects and why they have requested them. Right when I am about to admit defeat, the doors open and a man rolls a cart through with 7 large cardboard boxes labeled with the magic words, Capitol Museum Collection. After my initial shock wears off from requesting 7 items and receiving 7 boxes, I throw my previous game plan out the window and I pick up the first box. William Yates Atkinson served as the governor of Georgia from 1894 through 1898 after a career as a dedicated member of the Georgia House of Representatives. While most of his political career was served in the decades after the Civil War, he spent most of his youth experiencing the effects of living in a Confederate state. We can only speculate that his experiences with the Civil War led him to the University of Georgia to graduate with a law degree in order to better serve a state and people ravaged by war. As a public servant, Atkinson was dedicated to promoting the 1895 Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. Like most events in the Redemption and Reconstruction era, the 1895 exposition was dedicated to highlighting the strength, progress, and overall worthiness of the South. As the current governor, it is understandable to see why Atkinson would promote the exposition in order to prove that the state was in fact thriving. Event organizers invited Booker T. Washington to give the keynote address in order to show that the South was in fact serious about racial equality and progress. It was this false sense of racial equality that Atkinson and others used as a springboard to thrust Georgia into a new era of production and commemoration. Shortly before the 1895 exposition in 1889, the Georgia General Assembly would once again revive this office of state geologist. While the position came and went through Georgia's early history, it was consistently dedicated to collecting specimens that were to illustrate Georgia's scientific and economic resources. It was this position that William Smith Yates inherited in 1893, only 3 years before the 1895 exposition. In 1893, Yates was named the state geologist and would publish numerous reports on the state of minerals and resources in Georgia. In 1895, Yates was tapped to create a display for the Cotton States and International Exposition, showing off the superiority and desirability of Southern resources. After creating this display, Yates was asked by Governor Atkinson to begin collecting specimens for a museum, then known as the Georgia State Museum, dedicated to the natural resources of Georgia. Yates established himself as an expert on Georgia's natural resources, therefore making what he collected for the museum inherently worthy. In its original conception, this collection was designed to shake off the war-torn images of Georgia and convince Americans that the state had worthy resources that would make significant contributions to rebuilding the country and economy. It wasn't just a display dedicated to the history of Georgia, but also a narrative for a hopeful and bright future. The display that Yates created for the 1895 Atlanta Exposition would form the basis of the Georgia State Museum. During the Capitol renovation and restoration in 1992, funds would be dedicated to updating the handling of the collection. Officially renamed the Georgia Capitol Museum in 1997, the collection would be known as a hodgepodge of different artifacts that had not been updated since 1896. After creating a more traditional museum environment on the 4th floor of the Capitol building, the Capitol Museum collection finally had a permanent home. Although most of the artifacts in this collection usually are not designated for display, the artifacts of the storeroom have been cared for and stored by the University of Georgia since 2011. Under the care of the Richard B. Russell Library, the forgotten Native American artifacts in the Capitol Museum collection were organized in catalogs by librarians and archivists in 2014. Without a provenance history, over time, these artifacts have been swallowed by the storeroom and forgotten by historians, not willfully or maliciously, but simply taking part in the cycle of museum artifacts. Within this cycle, we must consider the place these artifacts occupy as objects that live and negotiate space within Southern memory. And my research, I anchor it in through several different works. Andrew Denson's Monuments to Absence, Cherokee Removal, and the Contest over Southern Memory. I use this to show how Southern history tries to claim connections to indigeneity by any means necessary, by participating in the narrative erasure of Native voices, perspectives, and history. While recent history has seen commemoration as a hot-button topic in the South, Denson points out that some of the same institutions that work to exclude African Americans from public memory proved willing to recognize and even apologize for the Trail of Tears. We can see this as the way in which Southerners try to claim a connection to indigeneity. It is that same impetus that drives the willingness to commemorate the Trail of Tears. It drives amateur collectors to collect and eventually donate their artifacts. While claiming connections to indigeneity, Southerners also commit narrative erasure by reaffirming racial bias in stereotypes through emphasizing Indian disappearance. Removal commemoration functioned as a racializing practice and an activity that reproduced ideas of racial difference rooted in American settler colonialism. This trauma lives in the land in the South, and it can be remembered through the artifacts found in the soil. Sometimes trauma isn't enough to prompt people to decolonize particular historical discourses. With each object that was used as a practice of commemoration in the Capitol Museum collection, the ability to repatriate or reaffiliate the artifact decolonizes the narrative erasure within Southern commemorative practices. And I will say that although I mostly speak about Native American populations and Native artifacts, this idea can also be applied to African American ancestry, the history of slavery, and mostly just memory in the South. Repatriation as a word and an action is heavily charged. The precedents set by repatriations of the past prove how complicated and lengthy the process can actually be because of the multiple layers and groups involved. This worthy struggle is perfectly captured in Chip Colwell's Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits. And through reading it, ultimately I realized Colwell was right. He said, "It strikes me how repatriation is not an endpoint so much as a process. Each case is a choice between resistance and respect. Each case is a new struggle to meaningfully come to terms with history. Each case is an attempt to diminish the culture clash between museums and tribes. Each case offers a hope to finally answer who should control the future of the past. Every repatriation is not an end, but a chance for a new beginning. In order to create meaningful research surrounding Native histories, we have to understand and enhance this. While the Capitol Museum collection does not include remains, by examining the process of repatriating remains, we can understand more thoroughly how complex repatriation is and how important it is for Native people. We can see this struggle within institutions across the globe, and it is made even more complicated with the Capitol Museum collection. Understandably, I can see why these objects haven't been dealt with, because time, resources, and manpower are valuable in large institutions. In a conversation with Joe Big Medicine, ritual elder and NAGPRA representative for the Southern Cheyenne, Colwell details Big Medicine saying, "NAGPRA doesn't heal, the process does." By going through this process, myself and subsequently the University of Georgia are able to participate in a larger theme highlighted by Colwell. Repatriation itself has been a key theme in the plot to shift museums into a mediating space. Repatriation is not a dispute about material things, body parts, or sacred objects. Repatriation is about people. NAGPRA doesn't decide who owns the past. Colwell is right. It is about people, Native people. In order for Georgia to truly reckon with its Indigenous past, it must participate in the process of repatriation. And on the other side, there is an undeniable fascination with history in the South, Southern history to be specific. There's also a fascination with dark tourism and the ability to engage with troubled history safely. Taya Miles examines this in her work Tales from the Haunted South. Miles acknowledges that ghost stories as a form of historical narrative do double work. They call to mind disturbing historical knowledge that we feel compelled to face, but they also contain the threat of that knowledge by marking it as unbelievable. In the same way, we can apply this mode of thought to Native artifacts in the amateur collecting world in Georgia. While Georgians are eager to lay claim to any indigeneity, they do so through the collection of Native artifacts, much like the Capitol Museum collection does. The artifacts allow people to engage with a traumatic historical past involving Native people from a safe emotional distance. Somehow the artifacts are able to put just enough distance between past events for the visitor to come closer to the trauma by being able to examine and touch something from thousands of years ago, in some cases. Some may ask, why the South? And Miles has an easy answer for that. Every region of this nation has ghost stories, but the South feels more haunted than the rest due to its brutal history of Indigenous land theft and removal, of Black chattel bondage and racialized torture, and of an ugly civil war. The Southern soil is soaked with unquiet blood. And that's something that I firmly believe, that trauma is bred into the soil in the South and is amplified by the way people collect Native Americans. While the intent may not always be malicious, the artifacts collected by amateur collectors and the inability to return those objects is malicious. The lingering intent for Americans has always been to present Native Americans as dead people, nothing more than ghosts. In order for American settlers to claim an authentic Indigenous identity in a new land, Native Americans had to be symbolically killed and buried, only to return as ineffectual ghosts or to be replaced by whites playing Indian. The same way Miles talks about Native ghosts, the state of Georgia curated its own narrative when creating the Capitol Museum collection. The first thing I notice is the immense weight of the box. I can barely pick it up and move it to my table. By this point, I have now taken over 3 tables in the reading room, and I weave through the chairs and the tables with this box, trying not to trip or drop it. I open the box and I find it entirely full with rocks. Trying not to burst out laughing at the absurdity of my situation, I realize these are chunky stones. Used to play a game, these stones are from the woodland and Mississippian eras and are found throughout the southeastern and midwestern parts of the United States. Holding these Mississippian stones in my hand, I feel the smooth edges and close my eyes, trying to transport myself to a time where the labor to create these round stones would have taken weeks or even months. The next box would include 2 antlers from an unknown animal, 2 large books of coins that commemorate the signing of the Declaration of Independence made by the Franklin Mint in 1972, a metal foldable cooking pan, a large spool of red, white, and blue synthetic rope, an old folded belt, a hollowed out piece of wood, and a falling apart book entitled The Cherokee Physician. There is no provenance history included with these items, nor an explanation of the organizational structure that brought these items to coexist in their cardboard home. Only a piece of paper that details the objects included in the box that was dated from 2014. As time went on and I moved through the boxes, I noticed a similar pattern. The paper from 2014 would be present, detailing the items in the box, whether it was correct when I opened it or not, and the objects were wrapped in bubble wrap or tissue paper. Some had been disturbed and some had not. Some had been ripped haphazardly apart by the person before me who went through them. These objects felt simply forgotten. Not forgotten through malicious intent or intentional ignorance, but forgotten through the collection of other more exciting pieces. The sadness I felt earlier melted away when I began to open the boxes that held the vases, jars, and bowls I initially requested. Suddenly, the magnitude of what I was going to do struck me, and I was nervous. I attempted to situate myself within the historiography of books I have already read, thinking about how those authors felt the first time they held something that was considered ancient. I began unwrapping objects that have not been touched in years, and all I could think about was the ancient dirt and dust I was covering myself in. In conclusion, I would like to discuss my place and identity within this project as sort of an acknowledgement of bias or an acknowledgement of my place in the settler colonial structure. I understand and acknowledge that I occupy a space of immense privilege. I am a white passing Native person at a well-funded academic institution with notable instructors who have enabled me to create this interesting project. Others who are not in my position are not as lucky. I have a desire to use this privileged place to the best of my ability to shed light on the complex relationship that Georgia has with Native people and Native history. As I mentioned earlier, I understand that in order to do this, I have to use the settler colonial structures that oppress and have oppressed Native people in this state. That being said, I've also struggled with my identity while grappling with these arguments and the finer points of this project. Do I have a right to be doing this? Am I being respectful enough? Am I even involved in the community enough to be able to do this? I think constantly about my place as someone who grew up outside of the Native community my matrilineal ancestors were born into. And ultimately, I realized that repatriation is not just the return of artifacts. This is a soul-searching process for those involved. And that particular trip to special collections felt like jumping into the deep end of a pool, and as I walked down the steps in the rain back to my car, I didn't feel the same dread or doom I felt hours before. Instead, I felt a sadness and melancholy that I couldn't describe. The orphaned artifacts of the Orphaned Capitol Museum collection. The potential these items have for repatriation and reaffiliation is monumental, and by embarking on this journey, I am hopeful that others will come after me to continue what I have started. This will allow people across the country to engage with history in other tangible ways that doesn't include walking on colonized and traumatized land. In order to break the hold these narratives have on the South in particular, we must start with repairing the relationship between Native people in the state of Georgia. We live in a time where a Native woman was confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior in a historic and frankly long overdue nomination. This profound change within the settler colonial structure opens a door to a new way of engaging with Native American history in tangible settings. I feel trepidation at embarking on this journey, but I also feel compelled by the energy of something larger than myself and my own identity to find a resolution for as many of these artifacts as I can. Whether that resolution is repatriation or an exhibit that highlights the oddities of the collection or something else, I cannot say. But until then, there is at least one person with the orphaned collection on their mind. Thank you all so much. I will pass it off to my colleague, Jared Asser.
Hello, everyone. Let me begin by saying how sorry I am that we cannot be together in Charleston this year. And I must also apologize, unlike my two co-panelists, I am not a natural public speaker, so I am forced to read from my script. My paper today is titled From Jewish American History to Decolonial Pedagogy, and it employs a seminar paper I wrote last term as the kernel for a new way to approach teaching the first year American History survey. I will start by reviewing the relevant parts of this research before developing this one event into a larger way of thinking about teaching American history. Let me stress that this presentation is only a first pass on this idea and is more suggestive than conclusive. And I aim here to develop a decolonial approach to the teaching of history. For me, this means changing not only what we teach, but considering how the stuff of history has the potential for broader intellectual growth in our students. Writing about the Reconstruction period, one historian recently stressed the importance of teaching the contingency of race. Students approach history with a certain mindset that draws on old and established racial prejudices. A lack of attention to the role our teaching plays outside of the classroom or the discipline is not easy. It may be potentially harmful. Much intellectual labor throughout the West and its history has gone toward the invention and the maintenance of race and racial categories. We may preserve these racial categories in our teaching implicitly, if not explicitly. For example, David Goldstein has criticized the works of David Roediger and Matthew Jacobson Fry, who write about the history of whiteness. These authors locate the Irish and Eastern Europeans, respectively, as somewhere in between Black and white. And in so doing, they may have inadvertently naturalized the categories that they are arguing are constructed. I define today decolonial in a very broad sense of challenging or removing Western assumptions and patterns of thought from research and teaching. Today, I focus on pushing back binary and categorical ways of thinking. We should direct our pedagogical attention toward the US History Survey for one simple reason. It is the only history class every undergraduate student can be expected to take, and it is here where the greatest return on intellectual investment may be made. What better way to challenge the conceptual power of race than by teaching its creation throughout American history? Having stated my aim, I would like to give a content warning for this paper. My graduate research focuses largely on topics of violence and the American far right, and many of the examples that I draw from today, and especially in the later portions of the paper, draw on moments of racialized violence. So please feel free to contact me by email if you would like to discuss these ideas, but no longer wish to view this presentation. With that said, earlier in the year, I was researching a particular incident in Great Depression, Alabama, where anti-Jewish and anti-communist sentiment developed into anti-Black violence. 2 African-American teenagers and 1 African-American man were being tried for a murder that they did not commit. And when news of this trial made it to the North, the Communist International Labor Defense dispatched 3 Jewish lawyers to defend them. While previously calm, at news of this event, the Alabamans, led by the revived KKK, launched a campaign of terror and violence against the Black, not Jewish community, lasting for almost 6 months. Activists, both Black and white, believed that social and economic equality in the 1930s would require outside intervention. The ILD lawyers represented such an opportunity, certainly because they were communist, but also because they were Northern Jewish men. As Goldstein has argued, Jewish Americans in the South whitened more quickly and more completely than their counterparts in the North. The foundation of an enslaved economy gave them a, quote, automatic level of social acceptance that was unparalleled in any other Western society of this period, end quote. However, this was not necessarily true of Jewish Americans in the North, who may have whitened less completely. As Robin Kelly has argued, in this period, Black Alabamans had been awaiting an opportunity such as this one. Memories of the Reconstruction period persisted among sharecroppers in Alabama, and in moments like this, a vision of interracial politics held the potential for a more equitable world. This project led me to begin looking at other instances where Black, white, and Jewish actors interacted in the process of making race. What I found more broadly was that the racialization of Jewish Americans became most powerful during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, where a large public discourse developed attempting to settle them into the category of either Black or white. I'll quickly discuss 2 such instances. The first is the 1915 lynching of Leo Frank, a Marietta pencil factory manager. After a young girl, Mary Fagan, was found sexually assaulted and murdered in the basement of his factory, an intense and public discourse erupted surrounding the investigation and trial of the murder. Debate focused on the guilt or innocence of Frank, a Jewish American man, and the African American janitor, Jim Conley. Ultimately defying what we may have expected in the 21st century to have happened, it was Frank who was lynched, not Conley. The Frank case has been the subject of much academic study, but important to our purposes is the contemporary outpouring of articles and debates in the Black, white, and Jewish press. When Conley testified that he helped move the body of Mary Fagan after the fact, the white press took this as an opportunity to comment on the slave mentality of Conley. Comments of this type racialized Conley as below Jewish men, but did not necessarily indicate full parity of Jewishness and whiteness. Jewish-white relations in the early 20th century were frustrated by immigration, and Jewish Americans were increasingly seen as both inside and outside the category of white. The white press stirred anxieties as Jewish people were thought to not make the same kinds of racial distinctions that white Southerners made. This located them both inside and outside of whiteness and acted as a challenge to the black-white binary. Broadly speaking, the Jewish press fell in with Frank's lawyers' ammunition in the Frank case. Their status as white was tenuous, and there would be consequences if they became racialized as black, or to put it another way, failed. The black press offered mixed reactions. While many closed ranks around Conley, some saw the broader implications of the trial and questioned the racial status of Jewish Americans, not as an attack on Frank, but as an opportunity for a black Jewish solidarity of the kind that could not exist if Jewish Americans were racialized as white. In the reactions to the trial of Leo Frank, there existed a discourse in which the American understanding of how Jewish people should be racialized was debated and remade. Southern Jewish men did not fit into these categories of either black and white, and much racial hand-wringing was required to work out how to place Frank into a category. The second example is in the writings of Thomas Dixon Jr., who is among my least favorite people. This deeply racist author wrote extensively on the question of how Jewish should be racialized and offers a contrasting example to the Frank case. In his 1907 novel, The Traitor, a Jewish man is attacked. The attack is led by renegade Klansmen, and the true Klansmen come to his defense. This clearly indicates Dixon's belief Jewish people should be covered by the protective veil of white supremacy. The man's name, Mr. Nicharoshinsky, is also significant. The suffix "ski" tells us that the character is likely of Polish descent, and if not Polish, certainly Eastern European. Throughout this period, mass migration of Southern and Eastern Europeans, beginning in the 1840s and continuing into the 20th century, whiteness was continually refined and came to be understood as Protestant and Anglo-Saxon. This change influenced the racialization of Eastern European groups, in particular affecting their avenues of labor, and as they were excluded from whiteness. So Dixon's character, Nicharoshinsky's Jewishness, may actually have brought him out of the category of non-white Eastern European and into the realm of whiteness. All of this to say, Jewishness confounded the racial bias formalized in Jim Crow in unpredictable ways. This insight from Jewish American history could be used to design a decolonial curriculum. What better way to challenge preconceptions of race than to teach how it was created in the first place? As Omi and went on to claim, quote, processes of classification, including self-classification, are reflective of specific social structures, cultural meanings and practices, and of broader power relations, end quote. Race is a master category shaping class, gender, and sexual relations. It shapes who gets access to what resources, ways that are fluid over time. While I don't think that this is a controversial or revolutionary statement for us in this conference, it may be more so to our students. In Georgia, across the US, there are state-mandated general education requirements. One of these is that students take a first-year American history course either pre or post-Civil War. I propose that we shift history education towards these critical junctures interactions between between a variety of people who were racialized in several ways were unevenly resolved into a black-white binary of categories. The creation of race, decade by decade or generation by generation, has also shaped the larger structure of US society, and it is from this point that we can approach teaching US history. I've already gestured towards how this idea could play out in a classroom through my discussion of Dixon and Frank. Students cannot understand the Leo Frank incident without also understanding industrialization in the New South, the emergence of a new middle class, and the interracial urbanization that came along with it. This interpretation of Leo Frank also leads directly into the emergence of the 1920s KKK, and Klansmen, especially in West, put forward new definitions of race and citizenship, which further excluded Eastern and Southern European immigrants, Catholics, Jewish people, and African Americans, while simultaneously reinforcing the morality of whiteness and withholding it from others. Or consider the Reconstruction period. In the wake of emancipation, new forms of racist action and rhetoric had to be invented to challenge the legal, civic, and economic rights accorded to freedmen. The creation of a new derogatory sense of blackness was buttressed by new forms of whiteness. In Memphis, decommissioned Black Union soldiers were killed by Irish policemen in an event that turned into a massacre of freedmen. The Irish are key here. Students are accustomed to thinking of the Irish as white. While this may be the case in our own time, it was not the case in the mid-19th century, as Americans adopted and then built on the racialized discourse that justified England's colonization of Ireland. While important in its own right, Reconstruction in the broader Mississippi Valley represents an important instance where the Irish began to whiten. And lest this paper recreate the very black-white divide it seeks to undermine, let's consider San Francisco. A challenge, perhaps, for those of us who are fans of the SEC. In the late 19th century, Chinese and Japanese Americans were understood by white Americans to be completely separate races with all of the baggage that this entails. It was only over time that the two collapsed into a single category of Oriental. In addition, the concept of race is unable to account for how some indigenous groups created their communities. Consider Melinda Maynor Lowry's study of the Lumbee of North Carolina, one of the largest indigenous groups this side of the Mississippi. Many of the Lumbee are of mixed indigenous African American descent and defined themselves through kinship, a series of social relationships, including ties to the land. As Jim Crow was being formalized in North Carolina, the Lumbee simultaneously continued to use kinship to define themselves, but mobilized the concept of race in their favor outside of their communities. Drawing on ambiguous sounding words to name their institutions, they presented themselves to the broader American community as a mixed white indigenous, not black indigenous group of people. In so doing, they retained their own systems of self-identification while gaining some degree of political power. Teaching this race-centered form of history denaturalizes race while simultaneously revealing the social structures of the past. With a modicum of imagination, students may see how race is made in their own social and political circles. The way of studying racial formation presented here is focused on discourses. The skills that students gain, first modeled in lecture and then practiced in breakout sections, in interpreting and contrasting textual sources, could be applied to a capstone assignment. Such an assignment would ask whether the processes of racial formation in the present are or are not continuous from those in the past. An example that comes to my mind is in the early 20th century, discourses of public health and hygiene informed the racialization of Chinese immigrants in California. Whether or not the contemporary term China virus in place of coronavirus represents a continuation of this process would be up to students to interpret. Race does all kinds of intellectual work in our society, and turning the lens of our teaching onto race will denaturalize it and hopefully encourage students to see beyond other constructed binaries that shape their thinking. Binaries serve to create racial division, but more broadly, binary thinking justifies our conceptions of self, others, of the cultural and subcultural groups we're a part of, and how of and conceive of and define nations. Think of the examples in each of this talk. Reconstruction in Tennessee, and urbanizing and industrializing Atlanta. These are all moments of contingency, moments where new, probably more equitable social and economic orders were possible. This kind of education, more than teaching history, it is about making responsible citizens. The recreation of each of these moments functioned to prevent the birth of a new world, and hopefully by teaching in this way, we can encourage students to uncover race a non-binary, more humanistic way of thinking. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tedi.
Gotta unmute my computer.
Shall we answer some questions?
Yeah, I think it would be good. Now we can open up for questions. I'm sorry about the screen issue. I had noticed that early on, but I wasn't sure if it was a problem unique to myself. So I assumed it was my own personal problem. And you know what they say about when you assume. And I apologize, particularly to Robin. I just apologize in general. This is a platform I have never used. I know for all of y'all, Ariana did not have a PowerPoint. So there, you didn't miss visuals for her presentation, but I think we might have missed maybe a couple slides from Jared's. Really, we're all in a room together, so when I'm like looking around. Jared, the screen was just on me, silently sitting here watching y'all present. And I think our moderator behind the scenes managed to figure it out. Eventually, I think you might have missed like maybe the first of one of Jared's, whatever you call that, a PowerPoint or a thingy.
I also would just like to add that I chose specifically to not have a PowerPoint. To not have a PowerPoint because I do not have a history of the objects that I am discussing, and therefore I believe it would be pretty disrespectful to show some objects that I have no right to, which is another complicated part of the repatriation process as well.
So I didn't, let me see if I can get, I didn't necessarily see any questions. I saw some nice comments. But if there are questions, you can put them in the chat and we'd be happy to answer them. I think that's about it. Otherwise, we've talked for an hour. We're supposed to go until 2:30, I think. I have no more for you.
I can discuss a little bit about Joe's comment earlier. It says repatriation, a variation of reparation, which I absolutely, completely agree. A lot is owed to many, many people. And that is why the repatriation process is so very complicated. And I was discussing earlier today with one of my professors in the anthropology department, and we were talking about NAGPRA. Is it actually helpful or a hindrance to the repatriation process? Because other nations don't have NAGPRA specifically. They might have other processes, and what can we do moving forward about repatriation? Because I do firmly believe that repatriation is reparations, and reparations are owed to a great number of people, especially in Georgia and at the University of Georgia, where, you know, the two major streets on this campus are named two people who championed Indian removal, and our campus, most of it was a former plantation. So we have a lot to reckon with in the state of Georgia, and I think my colleagues and myself are offering some pretty compelling arguments. If anybody would like to read my paper or discuss further, absolutely, please feel free to reach out to me. I think our emails were included on the final agenda. So please absolutely feel free.
I am a grad student. I do love answering questions. It's part of my job.
Yeah, I was going to say you can connect through the Socio page. So feel free to reach out to me there. I would be happy to share the final copy of this paper. I have a number of thoughts on how this paper will be sort of expanded in the future, and maybe places to publish it. But as of right now, I don't think it will be. Joe says, Georgia, our message is becoming taboo in red states. I don't know. I think the South is uniquely positioned to be pretty revolutionary in terms of radical ideology, but
we just might have to convince a few people along the way.
We certainly have people to convince. But yeah, as far as sort of these comments about people losing land. Living in Beaufort for 8 years, you can't go anywhere without seeing my neighbor. We lived in downtown Beaufort, and our neighbor, his mother's home was a tax sale. It's literally everywhere, and in places that you don't think of. And I think part of the problem, as Jared is confronting, is there's just a complete lack of knowledge. Kids grow up with very little information, and what do we do about that? When the only class they're going to take in college is this one, and they can either take before 1865 or after 1865, and the information they're going to get from it is really limited. Yeah, I don't have much more to add than that. I don't know if Jared, if you have anything you wanted, last thoughts. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I mean, my last thought on decolonial thinking is that there's a great paper titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And as much as we like to think that brain work is sufficient, I think, as both Tedi and Ariana have addressed, you can't decolonize from a colonized space. And if we don't, this is extremely prescient or prominent in Canada as well. If we don't find or arrive at some kind of political equality between Indigenous groups in Canada, Indigenous groups in the federal government, in the South, this will look something different. We're not going to move forward in any significant way. I think that education is an extremely important part, but education is really only the beginning of thinking about decoloniality. Unfortunately, as an educator, I only get students for 12 weeks. It's difficult to measure or guess at the influence that I have on the students that I have. But fortunately, we're seeing Indigenous-led, land-based movements across the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. So the future is brighter, I think, than we think when it comes to these kinds of things. That is my final thought.
Yeah, I also am very optimistic. I think that's just who I am as a human. I'm married to the least optimistic person on planet Earth. But I guess it's about balance. And
I am optimistic, but always skeptical.
well, I guess that's good. I think there's something to the idea, Ariana and I are both more on the public history side of this, and thinking about the ways that we present our materials to the public, the deeply embedded problems of the academy, the way that materials are written and presented to people. I think to Catherine, I think if we all designed the way that we talked about history as if we were designing it for a middle schooler, we would be way better off. Sometimes I read things that people write and they make me feel stupid. And I know I'm not stupid. It's just we're often writing to echo chambers just to make ourselves feel better about our own research. But as Jared is pointing out, history, the field of history is about creating informed citizens. I think it has a sort of a didactic purpose about creating an electorate that's informed and responsible. And I think when we write these wordy, horrible things that only real, super smart people could even get through, we're exacerbating a problem. And so when we have these public history programs like the Slave Dwelling Project, where people can have extra sensory experiences that are designed they're designed for everyone of any level, inclusive history. We can understand the roots of American problems that we're dealing with today in a way that we've never really tried to do it before. And I think that has to be a priority. So I'm glad y'all got something out of our presentations. And if there are no more questions, I don't know if we're allowed to leave early. I guess we can just sit here.
And thank you to the conference organizers for giving
yes.
us this opportunity.
We really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Yes.
A couple of grad students given an opportunity is it's a big deal. So thank you. We appreciate it.
We were really excited. I know when I saw the conference posted, I knew that this would be a wonderful opportunity for all of us to kind of get together and talk about the ways in which obviously we've presented a pretty wide array of stuff. I don't know if there's a better word for it, but I think it came together really well. So thank you, as Jared pointed out. It's good to say thank you.
With that,
I think that's it. I can put us on mute, and we can sit here. I don't know how this works.
yeah, if there's no more questions, we're going to go ahead and close out our session. Like we said, if anybody would like to connect or talk about ideas, please reach out to us. And again, thank you all for listening to our presentation, and have a wonderful rest of your day and an amazing weekend.